Hi, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm thrilled to announce that I'm here with a very distinguished professor of philosophy, who's I'm just turning off this volume here, Dr. Timothy McGrew, who comes from Michigan. He's a university professor. He's an expert in all kinds of different topics. He's published in journals and books, and he's quite famous in his own right. And he also has a wife who's pretty famous too. And she's also an active author, and she's also a professor. And so two brains make a third brain. So that third brain is now apparently the chess champion in Michigan, or at least when I listened to the video that you were on with Cameron Bertu. Cameron, you indicated that your daughter had beaten you at chess, and you're a master chess player. So I found that. So I think the two combined brains, I mean, my gosh, your daughter had no choice but to be a completely very intellectual.
We have three daughters. One of them is finishing her doctorate in mathematics. She's the oldest. Then the middle daughter is the one who's the Michigan women's chess champion for 2 years in a row. Both times she's played in it, she's won it. And then my third daughter is the artist of the family. And so she's into painting, drawing, and all things artistic. So we have the whole range of it covered in our household.
Wow, no, that's neat. That's wonderful. It's probably a lot of fun there. And I think now that I do recall Lydia saying that there were more than one child, and that she was homeschooling them too, which is a real champion sort of a thing to do, especially for a person who's working full time. And
actually, Lydia is a full-time mom. She publishes massively. She's got a wonderful publication record, but she stays home and homeschools the kids and then writes books and articles in her spare time. So she could certainly be a professor, but she has chosen not to be, and to devote her time to this, which is, believe me, it's a full schedule.
It's a monumental task, and I have to give her a lot of credit, because I also know that she's obviously done a great job, and that your daughters are so well-rounded and all that kind of good stuff. So that's fantastic. So what I wanted to ask you about, I listened to your other interview, and I heard a lot of really interesting topics, and I think some of them would be interesting also to bring up here. But one of those topics, and actually before we do that though, should we point out right now about Lydia's new book?
Oh, sure. I have it in advanced review copy right here. It is called The Mirror or the Mask, and it is about the question of how the Gospels should be written, or should be read, rather, how they were written, and in consequence, how we ought to read them, whether the authors used literary devices which allowed them to introduce fictional elements, but the audience kind of understood that, sort of like a biopic, or whether instead we should look at them as being reportage, people who are close up to the facts and habitually truthful, trying to say what happened in pretty much the straightforward way you would expect. And Lydia argues for the latter point of view and does a really thorough job going over a lot of things that even contemporary evangelical scholars have been saying, and subjecting them to some criticism that is informed and detailed. She goes back into Aelius Theon's Progymnasmata, which is a writing textbook. She goes into Plutarch and Sallust and Tacitus and Cicero and these other ancient authors, and unpacks what's going on there. It is almost 550 pages, and that is not light going, but she writes in a way that's pretty accessible. I think a lot of people, even who don't consider themselves to be super scholars, will find much of value there, and they'll be able to process that and read that. So I do think that that's going to be a lot of fun for people, especially people who've been tracking what's been going on in these areas in the past few years.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's fantastic. And I read her book on undesigned coincidences, and I thought, just like you pointed out in this new book, she is very thorough with how she goes through and identifies all of these different things in the Gospels. And so I think this is obviously brings a lot of utility to people.
I think so too. And people who have gotten a sneak peek preview of this material have spoken up and said so. So I think this will be really interesting. And it's only one of two books that she's been writing. This one will be out maybe November, December of this year. And then she has another one just focused on the Gospel of John. And so that one is in process. She's talking to us about chapters that she's drafting and writing right now. So she's a machine. She just keeps on going.
Wow. Yeah. And I actually heard when you were talking to Cameron Bartuzzi, I heard you say that the Gospel of John is your favorite.
It is actually.
Still true?
It is. Yeah. Well, it hasn't changed in the past, 4 weeks or so since I talked to Cam.
Yeah, so I like the Gospel of John too, because I like the way that he really focuses on the miracles of Jesus. And I also like just the way that it ties back to Genesis, even in some of the wording and some of the vision, what's it called? Some of the, I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That just goes back to
Right.
the
Yeah.
very beginning, and I think that's
The
great.
imagery and the language and the metaphors are very resonant there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the other things I think would be interesting to talk about is, and I think you've
I think something's wrong.
I think SJ is reconnecting here.
Yeah, well, it's good. Sorry I'm late.
Okay, are you there?
I am here, and we're trying to get SJ back. I think she realized that she got frozen there and is probably working on reconnecting with us.
Sorry about earlier. There was something wrong with my sound. I cannot figure it out.
No worries.
Well, anyway, yeah, I was listening to the beginning where you were talking about Lydia with
Yep.
that with some more doing some more chapters for some more books that she's writing, and that's very interesting. Um, the first book, which I haven't read completely, can you say the name of that book one more time?
Sure. The name of the first book that Lydia wrote, which is a 2017 book, is Hidden in Plain View: Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. What it does is looks at ways that the various parts of Scripture interlock with one another and explain one another. They interlock in ways that point to truth. They would not be expected to interlock in these ways if they were fictions or forgeries. So the fact that we see these interlockings is itself pretty good evidence that these authors are close to the facts, that they're habitually truthful, that they are not using fancy literary devices or just telling fables, but rather that these are grounded in the same independent historical reality. So the book surveys examples of this among the Gospels, and they crisscross the Gospels in all directions.
Yes.
Things in the Gospel of John explain things in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Synoptic Gospels explain things in John. Some of the Synoptic Gospels explain things in other Synoptic Gospels. They go all directions. So it's a really fascinating kind of evidence that we can find only when we have multiple texts that all touch on the same kind of historical situations and the same incidents of the same people. But they are not just cases where one author copies from another author or says something in such similar terms that you might think he's copying from another author. Instead, they're very subtle, and some of them are so subtle that even people who've been reading the Bible for all their lives look at them and say, oh, I never saw that there. Why didn't I see that interconnection? So it's a kind of evidence everybody has. You're carrying it around in your Bible, and you don't have to become an archaeologist or learn Greek or Hebrew. You don't have to become some kind of specialist in order to be able to make this connection. Instead, you can see it right there in front of you. It's a matter of connecting the dots. And the funny thing is, it's easy to miss. I'm the son of a Bible college professor. I've been taking a serious interest in the Bible for many decades, and I didn't see any of this stuff until someone pointed it out. But once it's pointed out, you can't unsee it. You realize, oh, that's really there. It's like seeing, something like you find the Dalmatian hidden in the picture of the autumn leaves, and then suddenly you always see the Dalmatian when you look there. You can't unsee it at that point.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this type of apologetic methodological approach goes back to the 18th century, really, to William Paley, to
Yes.
I believe, I'm not sure if it's either George Campbell or Joseph Butler, but I think they utilize something similar.
Paley uses it, and then when you move up to the 19th century, early 19th century, John James Blunt picks up on Paley's use of it. Paley does it for the book of Acts and Paul's letters. So he connects the dots with passages out of the books of Acts and passages in Paul. And then Blunt comes along and he develops the argument and interlinks that argument with what we see in the Gospels. And then, in fact, his work went through multiple editions, and in each edition, he expanded things. So he goes into the Old Testament historical narratives and the prophetical narratives, and he connects the dots in a lot of ways there as well. I have, in fact, given an entire talk, though not one that's been recorded, just on undesigned coincidences in the Old Testament. And that is a lot of fun. I love studying these things. And I must say, I never knew this kind of evidence existed when I was in Bible college. I was interested in evidence. I wanted to have the evidence. I was looking at books of apologetics, and no one ever mentioned this to me. So it is kind of it's a hidden gem. It's something that we really need to rediscover. And that's why Lydia wrote that first book, Hidden in Plain View, for the sake of helping to revive this argument.
Absolutely. And I think it really speaks to the historic core and the historical understanding at the time that the gospel writers and the writers of the epistles, there was a cultural context going on. We often hear about from the Bart Ehrmans and different kind of scholars of this form critical approach, this evolved understanding, this late viewpoint, and it doesn't take into account living eyewitnesses or living testimony to these facts. So I really am, I've been studying this for some time, and it was really a I was really, it brought to me another apologetic method, something that I hadn't learned about. And I'm really thankful for that method. Yeah.
Yeah, so the methodological aspects are really interesting. There's, we can do this either in a casual way or in a complex way. If we go at it casually, people recognize sort of instinctively that when you've got this kind of interconnection, when the authors are explaining one another, then you really do have a case here for the accuracy of these people. Hey, SJ's back with us. Yay.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. My whole internet just crashed on both computers, and I had to switch to a different. I've got different routers and things, so I had to switch, completely redo everything.
Oh, I am so sorry. Anyway, we've just been talking a little bit about the undesigned coincidences argument and Lydia's first book as well. And then you were right at the point of saying that there was something that was interesting that people would like to hear. And then you froze on me. So I don't even know what the interesting thing is. So if you can recover that, tell me what that is. We'll keep going.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I was talking about the idea of the reliability of the Gospels, and a lot of people are saying that, do we need to have every single word to be the exact same original word, or do we think we have enough to be able to be confident in our Christianity with what we have today? Do we have enough from the past? And even in the extra biblical materials that are out there, do we have enough, do you think, that Christians can feel that they wouldn't even necessarily need the Gospels, for example?
Yeah, I am really wary of any approach that says we could just throw the Gospels out and do everything with the epistles of Paul. And I'm not saying this to downplay the evidential value of Paul's epistles. What I do want to say, however, is that the Gospels remain our first and best point for learning much about what Jesus taught, what Jesus did, and that is by no means all reproduced in the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul are consistent with that picture. I think that there is much even of apologetic value in the letters of Paul, so I'm not trying to deny that, but man, if we give away the Gospels, we're giving away a precious heritage, and we should not be ready to do that lightly. Not even to say, well, let me concede for the sake of argument all that you're saying about the Gospels. There's a big difference between making a concession, like, oh, I'll grant you that the Gospels are all full of contradictions and they're late and they're legendary, and on the other hand, saying, let's bracket that issue. I disagree with you, but let's bracket that and just look at some things here. There's a big difference between a concession and a sort of setting something aside for the sake of moving the discussion on a little bit. And I'm afraid that distinction is not always observed, and people are giving away with both hands things that there's no reason to give away. We don't have to have a verbatim tape recording transcript to have an accurate summary, but when we use words like paraphrase, they ought to mean something, and there are limits to what we can mean legitimately by paraphrase. So let me give you an example. One evangelical scholar who's very well respected and has done some excellent work in other areas has suggested that when in John's Gospel, Jesus on the cross, John 19, says, I thirst, this is a dynamic equivalent transformation of what we read in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, I just can't swallow that. That strikes me as really playing fast and loose with the notion of sameness of meaning. I thirst does not mean, and does not on any plausible manipulation of the text mean, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I really worry that once we sort of open Pandora's box and we let loose this idea that, oh, they felt free to adapt these things, and we have no limits on the use of the word paraphrase. We call things paraphrase that none of us would have called paraphrase in ordinary life. A paraphrase is recognizable when it deserves the name at all. It's something where we can say, oh, or if you had heard what was really said, you would say, oh, that's the occasion that's being referred to in this passage of scripture or whatever. But wow, the very notion that there are limits on paraphrase has just been blown past in some of these cases. And it really, I think, is a bad move and needs to be stopped. And that's part of what Lydia's book, The Mirror or the Mask, is designed to engage with, is this idea: did ancient authors really not have concern for literal truth? Did they really have this kind of license so that when they produced biographies or when they produced memoirs like the Gospels, they were really just sort of based on a true story, like a movie might be based on a true story? And if you watch the movie, you're okay with realizing some of this has been fictionalized to make a better story, but that's okay because I didn't really expect accuracy. That's the proposal that's on the table, and that's what Lydia investigates and goes through and just really thoroughly, which is why it's such a long book, right? I mean, a lot of people are probably sitting there thinking, nearly 550 pages. Wow. Where's that going to be on my reading list? But it has to be, because people have made claims that, well, this is what we see in Plutarch. This is what we see in Sallust. This is what we see in Tacitus. And something rides on the question of whether it is. Something else rides on the question of whether very Jewish authors would be likely to do these things even if it were. The Jews had a very high respect for truth, and you can see this, and the early Christians did as well. So surveying the early church fathers, Julius Africanus is a very important figure here, not somebody who plays fast and loose with the literal truth of what's being told. In fact, he excoriates some of his contemporaries for trying to say that the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are kind of ginned up to show things, even though that wasn't really Jesus' descent. And Julius Africanus just blows a gasket over that. He says, what are you even talking about? That's absolutely crazy. That would be dishonoring to God. We shouldn't think this thing at all. So Lydia's got a very rich discussion of the early church fathers with regard to this as well.
Oh, that sounds great. And I like the fact that what you're mentioning, because I think that that's something that is missing. I don't think we have enough information on what people like Plutarch said and that kind of thing. And the fact that she's done the legwork for us is phenomenal. I can't wait to read the book.
Well, those chapters are probably chapters that some people will really dig into and other people will flip through. And that's okay, but it's there. And if you need it later, part of the point of writing a book that's this long and this thorough is some of this is reference material. And you might never know that you needed it until somebody pops up and says, well, what about ancient literary devices? And then you'll say, oh, wow, there's chapters and chapters of this. I need to go back and have all the footnotes and all the details and citations right at my fingertips, and it's all there.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I'm looking in the live chat, and I am back in the chat for those. And I'm sorry for everybody me missing, but I'm back in the chat so I can see your questions. And I see that Utopia Buster 2017 has a question, and it says, and I think it might speak to maybe explaining a little bit what these undesigned coincidences are, because Utopia Buster is saying, can undesigned coincidences be argued to be subjective and refuted on that basis? She said, I can see its applications for Christians, but not valuable in apologetics. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I actually think you can't just dismiss them as subjective, because words do have meanings, and the kinds of connections we're looking at are not easily written off as just sort of, pareidolia, as they say, as patterns that you see that aren't really there. Let me give you an example that might help to focus the discussion. In Matthew chapter 14, we have the story of the death of John the Baptist. And it's a story that we have in other Gospels as well. But in Matthew, it's funny because the setup for it has Herod Antipas turning to his servants, and he's heard about Jesus baptizing the Jordan with his disciples. He says, what's this? I had John the Baptist killed. What's going on here? Is he risen from the dead? What is this? Now, the fascinating thing about the passage in Matthew is that he's got just a little phrase in there that's not in any of the other Gospels. It's the phrase "to his servants." So here's a natural question that arises as we read that. Matthew, we are told, was a tax collector. Now he's a traveling preacher. How should he know what Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, is saying to his servants, presumably in the privacy of his own palace? Now, maybe the answer is, we don't know. And that's okay. There are a lot of things in ancient history where we can ask a question, we don't know what the answer is. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it would be more satisfying if we had a plausible answer to that question. Well, you can read all around in Matthew. You will not find anything else that's going to shed any light on this. But if you go over to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, not the story of the death of John the Baptist, not a biography of Herod Antipas, just a list of people who supported the ministry of Jesus and his disciples. Luke 8:3 mentions that one of those people was Joanna. And then in a little parenthetical remark, it tells you who Joanna is. She's the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, Herod's household manager. And now it's not a mystery how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants. Now, when you see one connection like that, you can worry, and maybe this gets back to what the person in the chat was asking. You could worry, well, it's like putting two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. They kind of fit, they look like they're the same color, but do they really belong together, or did I do it wrong? But then when you get more and more and more pieces and a little picture begins to emerge, right? You see the puppy's eye and part of his ear and his nose. Even if you haven't assembled the whole puzzle yet, you realize this is not an accident. The picture is coming together, and you will not listen to the clever modern biblical scholar who says, oh, that's just subjective. Those pieces were not even from the same puzzle in the first place, and people made some of them up. No, the picture's actually emerging. It's really there. And when you give more examples, and I don't know if you want to take a lot of time to go through more, but when you give more examples like this, the picture does emerge, and it emerges very strikingly. I gave a talk on this at a church in Louisiana, and the first person who came up to talk to me afterward was a prosecuting attorney. And he shook my hand, he looked me right in the eye, he said, I'm an attorney, I do evidence all day long, I want more of that. So I gave him a book because I'm a professor, and that's what professors do, right? You ask us a question, we give you a book. Lydia's book wasn't out yet, but I had brought some copies of another one that I could give away, and I gave him a copy of that. Fifth or sixth person in line was a construction worker, mountain of a guy, hands like hams. He leans over me, he goes, I want more of that. I said, okay, what level are you looking for? Whatever level you was talking at this morning, that's the level I want. You got it, right? So I gave him a book. What am I going to do, right? But everybody gets this from all walks of life. And so I think once you see a number of these put together, the suggestion that it's just subjective, that you're imagining things, goes away, and you realize, no, this isn't what we would expect from fictions or forgeries. Nobody picks up the Fellowship of the Ring to sort of tie off those loose ends left over when you finished reading Moby Dick. It's not the way it works. These stories are not anchored in the same independent historical reality. The Gospels are, and that's why they interlock with one another in these interesting ways that are not just repetition of the same thing in the same words. They're really much more interesting than that.
I agree with you. And actually, I've been noticing a little bit of that in the Old Testament, too, some undesigned coincidences. So you do see that throughout the whole Bible. And what people might not realize is this book was written over 1,500 years by, 66 books and 40 or more authors. So and from 3 continents, 3 languages, and it's all very cohesive. So that in itself, because one of the persons in the audience, in Brian Stevens, and I'm going to ask you if you can elaborate on this, but he says, how do we know the Bible's the Word of God? And I know one argument is these sort of undesigned coincidences.
Yeah, but let's even back out a level, right? Before we get to talking about the doctrine of inspiration, which is a very interesting discussion, let's just talk about the question, is it reliable? Can we trust it? Can we look at it with the same tools that we would use to evaluate documents in secular history and see that it actually bears the marks of historical reliability over and over again? And the answer is yes. In all kinds of different parts, this argument from undesigned coincidences is one strand of a multi-stranded argument. There are also external evidences and connections between what we read in Scripture and what we find in secular sources or archaeological material, Josephus, Tacitus, other historians. So there's just tons of evidence of many different kinds. And that's important, because if there's just one kind of evidence, somebody can say, well, let me cook up some kind of explanation for why you got that one kind of evidence and the other kinds are missing. But actually, there's many different strands of evidence. There's the fact of the embarrassing details that we read, right? So we read just in the Gospel of Mark alone. Look at how the disciples are portrayed. These guys are now the respected leaders of the church, right? They are boastful, they are cowardly, they are stupid, they're incompetent, they're impertinent, and they're absent without leave on the morning of the resurrection. Who writes a propaganda narrative like that? Right? What's your excuse for producing this narrative of the life of Jesus where the disciples look like they're doofuses, unless that's really kind of how it went down?
Yeah, and
So
they were
there's
sleeping on the job.
right, like what,
Yeah,
guys, hello, what's going on with that? So that's just another line of argument all on its own.
absolutely.
You,
Absolutely. And I think also the criteria of embarrassment can be spread all throughout the book of Mark, with the women finding the tomb empty first,
right,
and some of the other gospels too. Um, I think you present a really great case, you and Lydia do, and I like to think of it as Richard Swinburne presents his argument as that cumulative case apologetic. And when all these pieces are added to this grand quilt or this grand puzzle piece, you can start to see connections. So when I approach Lydia's book, it's so it's such an engaging book because it really just comes at you with common sense. um, in everyday life, this is how we live our lives according to common sense. This is how the people write and the gospel narratives are held together. Just wondering if you could talk about common sense in there.
yeah. So I think you're exactly right. This is something that people do instinctively, right? We recognize when stories hang together. We can find this if we look for it in history. We can find it in ancient history. We can find it in modern history. If you read accounts of the Battle of Midway from Japanese generals and American pilots, you find these kinds of interconnections where the Japanese general will say, and then in the middle of this time, I was looking out into the Atlantic and I saw one guy in a boat. Sorry, not Atlantic, Pacific. One guy in a boat, really out there on the high Pacific in a boat. I've been out on Lake Michigan in a boat when it was slightly choppy. Not a fun experience. I don't think anybody was hundreds of miles from land in a boat by himself of his free choice. But then you read the stories of the American pilots, and one of them says that his plane was shot up so badly he had to bail out and he deployed his life raft. Oh, one guy in a boat, right? Everybody gets that when it's secular history. My sort of battle cry here would be no double standards. If you're going to do that in secular history, and you should, and it's obvious that you should, then do that with what you find in the Bible as well. And again, just for arguing on the basis of the sort of lowest common denominator, let's see whether this is historically trustworthy stuff. And this is only one set of considerations, right? We would also have to deal with the kinds of contradictions that are alleged. Bart Ehrman has a whole chapter on this in his book, Jesus Interrupted, called A World of Contradictions, where he talks about all of these contradictions among the narratives. And I think they pretty largely just dissolve on a close reading. And I could give examples of that as well. But
Yeah.
it's useful for us to see this as a multi-stranded approach so that we help to sort of reinforce the fact that, to change the metaphor just slightly, the different lines of evidence and the fact that they're cumulative weaves a tough safety net beneath our beliefs. This is not something where we're hanging by a chain, and if that one link of the chain breaks, the whole thing falls and we drop. No, it's more like a trampoline, where you've got hundreds of thousands of fibers woven together, and the whole weight of it doesn't have to be supported by just one fiber. It's really a tough, interlocking, woven safety net beneath our beliefs. And I find that be really interesting. And it's also what you find in legal evidence at its best, or forensic evidence, forensic detection at its best. We look for lots of different lines of evidence all converging on the same point.
Absolutely. It's kind of like a 3D puzzle, all with the inference to the best explanation and probabilities all pointing these different puzzle pieces into the right fit here
Yeah.
and there. Dealing with Bart Ehrman, I see these surface level, contradictions, but when you look at it, a lot of them go away. So, I mean, I would really like it if there were surface level contradictions, because it gives a sense of authenticity to the gospel accounts, the surface level contradictions.
Yeah, something that my friend J. Warner Wallace says, and he's a retired cold case homicide detective, is when you get honest witnesses who actually saw something together, when you get to interview them, he would rather keep them apart if he could, but if they're together, that's okay as well. But you almost always have variations. One person reports that someone was tall, another person says didn't seem to be anything special about his height. Well, the person who said he was tall might have been a kid who was, kind of looking up at the guy, and the other person may not have been. You get lots of surface level discrepancies, sometimes some actual discrepancies, but they fit together. And you learn not to be too worried about the fact that they're focusing on different factors or something like that. That's inevitable. We're all going to focus on one thing or another, see certain things that we think are more important than other things, leave things out, forget that we're really saying some things that go unexplained, and then other people can wonder, well, what was going on there? And that's just absolutely typical of trustworthy, honest human testimony right up close. So as a detective, he saw lots of that. As he's fond of saying, I bet I've interviewed more people than everybody else in the room put together as a detective. And so this is really the kind of evidence that we use there as well. And we should use, and we should be glad that we have, even if it means that sometimes there's some puzzling things. But back to Bart, let me just give you one example. Bart says at one point, how many women went to the tomb and what were their names? Was it Mary alone? John 20, verse 1. And he goes on and he says some other misleading things as well, but I just want to stop that. Okay, John 20, verse 1 says that Mary came and told the Peter and John what she had seen. Peter and the disciple Jesus loved what she had seen. And so it looks like he's just talking about Mary. He doesn't say it was Mary alone, but you go one verse further, just to verse 2 of John chapter 20. And she says, they have taken away the Lord, and we do not know what they've done with him. We do not know. Who's we if it was Mary alone, Bart? This is just one example of many of Bart's really fast and loose handling of these things. He wants to create as many contradictions as he can, and he's not above pulling a fast one on his readers at times in order to generate that impression. I think he's counting on their not actually reading the text for themselves.
Let me ask a question just to build on that, because Brian Stevens is in the thing, and he had just asked about the women, but now he's asking about the angels. So what would you say to the question of how many angels were there?
Yeah, so if you get your ideas of angels from the illustrations in Victorian magazines, you would get the impression that every angel appears with a parasail on his back. And this is actually not the way that messengers, angels, are portrayed throughout most of the Old Testament and in most Jewish understanding. Think of what Paul says, some have entertained angels unawares. How could you do that, right? Did you miss the bit on their backs? Where were the wings? Didn't you know that? Angels appear as men, right? When Abraham's got his tent and the angel of the Lord appears to him, he doesn't know he's entertaining the angel of the Lord just from the guy's face. He welcomes him as a guest and then gradually comes to realize, oh my word, I've got somebody here that's not who he seems to be. But that's the point. So when you look at who was at the tomb, right? Some of the Gospels say angels, some say men, but visibly, there'd be no difference. One Gospel talks about one angel who says something, doesn't say there weren't any others. Another says that there were two of them. And this is the kind of variation, again, that we get in honest testimony all the time. If anything, what this does show is that the Gospels haven't been cleaned up in order to sort of align them with our sense of what we should see, what we should find if we were looking at these narratives. Instead, they've been left kind of raw the way that they are. But actually, once you get over the idea that the difference between angels and men is easily detectable, then you have the difference between observation and interpretation, right? You observe some men at the tomb. Later, you interpret that. You're like, wait a minute, those weren't just men. Well, you can use either kind of description for what's going on there. And that's exactly what we find in the Gospels.
Yeah, it does seem that there's an overt or an explicit philosophical bias when it comes to theological talk. I see this all the time. And of course, as you know, and I've been studying this also, the people that interchange with David Hume, such as Thomas Reid, simply confronted Hume's scholarship and said, that's not something you live by. You, in your everyday affairs of life, you act differently than what you do in your study. And Thomas Reid, I don't have the passage right here in front of me. He says it's like a hobby horse, that when a man is sick, or a man takes to the marketplace, but if he would use this type of skepticism in the everyday affairs of life, his friends would quickly impanel a jury and never have the solicitude to leave him alone again. That's Thomas Reid to David Hume.
Yeah, so Hume himself says sometimes, and about some of his philosophical ideas, well, these are my reflections. But then I go down to dinner and I have a game of backgammon and I forget about all of that, all that fancy philosophical skepticism. One of Thomas Reid's friends was George Campbell, who was a theologian and a student of rhetoric. He actually was one of the sort of formative influences on the study of rhetoric, the modern study of rhetoric. And George Campbell wrote a book called A Dissertation on Miracles, which was a very thorough, very systematic critique of Hume's essay of miracles, almost line by line and point by point. And if you go back and you read Campbell's dissertation on miracles, he actually includes in his introduction to the volume some correspondence that passed between him and Hume. But I think that Campbell definitely gets the better of Hume in that argument. And Campbell was a major member of that Aberdeen circle of common sense philosophers, a major Scottish thinker.
Yeah.
So if you're into the common sense school, grab a copy of George Campbell and you can absolutely read to your heart's content. It's good reading. It's still very pertinent today.
That's great. I want to piggyback. Let me piggyback on that real quick, because there's something I want to go back to. I do want to talk about some of these influential atheists, because that's something that you mentioned also on Cameron's channel, which I thought was great. But I want to go back just to the one point that you made with the angels and the women, because I think that something that also needs to be said is that a lot of times people mention the people they feel were critical to the story. And so, for example, someone might say, I'm going to accentuate Mary Magdalene's appearance and talk a lot about her, but the other women were playing lesser roles and maybe I don't even bother mentioning them. Or you have other people who might say, well, I saw one angel, I'm going to mention that angel. And the parallel that I want to draw real quick is just the way that when you watch a football game, you might say, man, Tom Brady had a great night. Does that mean that only Tom Brady was out there? Does that mean no one was on the bench? What does that mean? So,
absolutely agree. As far as the lists of the women, Luke himself, after listing some names, says, and the other women with them. So that's an announcement. If you needed one, this list is not intended to be complete. When you read, I mean, gosh, it's just everyday life. I found myself a year or so ago telling my wife about a conversation I had. And right in the middle of my telling it, I realized I was telling it as if it had been a conversation with just one person, because that's the person I mostly was engaging with. That's the person who was speaking up. But there were actually more people in the conversation. They just weren't as active. So I focused on that one person and I presented it to her as I was talking with so-and-so, and he said this, and we got into this discussion. There were other people even who chipped in a word or two here and there, but one person was the main person. So that's what I focused on as I was telling it. I thought to myself, this is exactly what I'm seeing in the Gospels. One person's in the forefront, and even in courts of law, they'll say you're not allowed to take the testimony that someone was there as equal to the testimony that no one else was there. So you can go back and you could read Greenleaf and Starkey and other writers on the Anglo-American law of evidence, and they'll tell you, you can't take the failure to mention someone else's presence as if it were the assertion that the person was absent. That's just not allowed. So this kind of focus is something that we see constantly in ordinary life, in ordinary intercourse, in the testimony that we have in courts of law. It's just part of our normal common sense engagement with the world. And so to try to make heavy weather out of it and say, well, I won't bother with anything about that in ordinary life, but now it comes to a religious matter, I'm going to get all hyper skeptical. Wow. Could we stop with the double standard, right? Just one standard, please.
Well, I think a lot.
That's great.
That double standard. I think that double standard comes by their misunderstanding of probabilities. And I know you've talked a lot about this, how David Hume was only, didn't really have an understanding of calculus, only understood the intrinsic probability of something on our background knowledge, but not the overall probability with specific evidence considered. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, Hume was pretty innocent of mathematics. Somebody conveyed to him Richard Price's work on probabilities, and also Thomas Bayes' initial work, which led to the formulation we now call Bayes' theorem. And Hume pretty obviously didn't have the mathematical chops to read this stuff, put Bayes' essay in a drawer and never looked at it again. He is working with a very rough kind of approach to these things. He wants to say, well, a miracle is as improbable as it gets because it's a violation of a law of nature, and firm and unalterable experience has established the laws of nature. That's itself a little ironic, because Hume is the guy who elsewhere in the same book published in 1748 tells us, well, you can't take inductive evidence as rationally compelling now. That doesn't work. His essay on induction comes just a few essays back in the same book where he's got his essay of miracles, and suddenly it's all about induction. So that's funny in its own right. But then there's a kind of equivocation, there's a kind of failure to use words in just one way that happens when Hume and Hume's followers talk about testimony. So it starts out something like this. Well, you'll agree, won't you, that testimony is not a perfect source of knowledge. There are people who are honestly mistaken, and there are people who tell lies. Sure, who's going to deny that, right? That's pretty obvious. And you'll agree that what you have in the Gospels is testimony about some things. Well, yeah. Okay, so then this testimony is a very chancy foundation for you to base your reasoning on. Well, whoa. We're doing sort of, there are some kinds of testimony that are unreliable, and what we have in the Gospels is some testimony. Therefore, what we have in the Gospels is not very reliable. That's just an equivocation. You're taking testimony in soft focus at the beginning. You're saying, well, testimony in general isn't always trustworthy. And then you're taking it in narrow focus and pretending that that means this person's testimony here under these circumstances corroborated by these other testimonies can't be trusted very well either. Yeah. That doesn't follow. So there's just been a switcheroo in the argument, and it sounds very plausible. When you go along the surface of it, the words sound reasonable, and it's like the voice of Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. People want to, by swift agreement, seem wise and reasonable themselves, but actually it's just flim-flam. There is really not any solid reasoning there. And so I think that, and there's more to be said, and we could get all mathy, and I'm not going to drive away all of our YouTube watchers by throwing a bunch of equations out there, but this is definitely not an argument that has everything to it that's been thought. There's less here than meets the eye.
Yeah, I think it's more of a, well, I totally agree, first of all, but a philosophical a priori argument. But so it makes a determination before even looking at the particular evidence of the gospel miracles. And again, I would just imagine, a George Campbell or a Thomas Reed or a William Paley or somebody. They would have tore this argument to shreds. And even today, it's not respected, as John Ehrman, a non-Christian, has talked about, or has written a whole book. Could you delve into that, his argument?
Yeah, John Ehrman's a philosopher of science, now retired, I believe. He taught for many years in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Pittsburgh. And in 2000, he published a book that really upset a lot of people. It's called Hume's Abject Failure, The Argument Against Miracles. Now, it's one thing if a Christian comes out with a book with that title, but when an agnostic comes out with a book with that title, what are you going to do? And what Ehrman argues in the first half of the book is that Hume had a very poor grasp of non-deductive reasoning. Many of his contemporaries showed a much better understanding of that reasoning. And Hume's main argument in his essay of miracles would, if it worked, also prove to be a tremendous roadblock to science. It would truly be a science stopper. Now, of course, that's ironic, right? Because a lot of people want to say, well, Christianity is a science stopper. Why would you even bother doing research if you could just say, God did it somehow, and then you could just sort of push that away? No, it's a terrible caricature of the way that Christians have been doing science since the dawn of the scientific revolution, but let that pass. Ehrman says, if Hume's argument really worked, if we could reject upon improbabilities without considering the evidence, and there are many passages where Hume very explicitly says, we could just ignore the evidence now because this is a religious miracle. All men of sense would put it aside without even further examination. Way to ignore evidence, right? What I want to say to such people, and people who are impressed by or even worried by that argument, is if you are wrong, how will you know? When should you change your mind? Because if you start off saying, this is so improbable, I won't listen to any evidence whatsoever. I won't even look at the evidence. Yeah, okay, maybe you're right to ignore it. Life is short, right? But if you're wrong, how are you going to find out? Because ultimately, the only rational way that we have of finding out about these things is to come back and look at the evidence. And Hume is really giving people that silver bullet that they're longing for. Oh, please tell me how I can just not even bother with the evidence.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to also speak on that one of the persons in the audience is Brian Stevens, and I happen to know that he is very interested in statistics, and I think he teaches that at the college level. And he was asking about and I know you've actually looked at this because I listened to what you said with Cameron Bertuzzi, but you had calculated out, and I think it was the probability using Bayes' theorem of, was it the resurrection?
So we were looking at the resurrection, and we didn't calculate the probability of it, but we calculated what's called the Bayes factor, which is the ratio of the combined evidence given that it did take place divided by the ratio of the probability of the combined evidence given that it did not take place. And that likelihood ratio is what many probability theorists think is the best way of encoding the weight of that evidence. And if you look at those pieces of evidence, and there are some assumptions that we make, and we're very upfront about those assumptions in the article in the Blackwell Companion, but the cumulative weight of the evidence is really striking, many, many orders of magnitude greater numerator than denominator on what we take to be very plausible assumptions. Now, you can quibble with those assumptions. You'll get different numbers if you do. That's fine. But we wanted to illustrate how a cumulative case comes together. And in that case, there's a lot more to be said, but we laid out our cards very much on the table and said, all right, have a look at this likelihood ratio, which is what we would use to multiply the ratio of the prior probabilities in order to get the ratio of what we call the posterior probabilities, is really top heavy, immensely top heavy. And so, if you don't like the calculation, you can ask questions about independence. We have a section on independence. You can ask questions about the specific weights that we put in. Change them if you like. Put in the weights that you think are more plausible and tell me what you come up with. But I think any reasonable assignment of values here is going to run into a very strong cumulative case. And it's the same kind of reasoning we use to make a cumulative case in any area. We use this in biology. We use this in physics. We use this in forensic detection. We use this to figure out why there are grass clippings all over the kitchen floor. It's the kind of thing that we do. Our auto mechanics use this to try to diagnose things. Our surgeons and doctors and specialists try to figure out what's causing our symptoms. It's really just a mathematical cutting edge put onto what's commonly called inference to the best explanation. And that's pervasive in our cognitive
Yeah.
lives. That's everywhere.
Yeah, I like to put it this way. I think Bayes' theorem, the best way to think about it is to show that Hume's argumentation is not sound. Even Richard Swinburne gives it a 97% probability on Bayes' theorem. But the way I like to use it is to show that Hume's philosophy, his argumentation is not sound, and I just use inference to the best explanation.
And you can do it either way. I do it as just IBE, as it's called, inference to the best explanation, sometimes when I'm talking with non-specialists, because that's a vocabulary that people pick up on very quickly. When I'm talking to people who say, all right, show me all the details, I don't just want to be served the meal, I want to see all the pots and the pans. Then we bring out the equations and we look at them and we say, all right, here's how the reasoning goes. And we can have a good discussion of that. I don't mind if people want to pick at pieces of the math. Well, I wouldn't assign this little bit here quite the same probability you do. Okay, we can talk about that, but try it with your own numbers and see what happens. It is kind of surprising. And so this is a reason that I gravitate toward the math when people say, oh, I really want to get down into the details. All right, let's drill down. That's fine. I don't mind that a bit.
Let me ask you this. When you're looking at the resurrection, what exactly, some of the people in the audience are asking about the priors and sort of assumptions that you've made. And you mentioned you had
Sure.
some priors and some assumptions. So what would you say is, what's an example of one of those?
So we make the assumption at the outset, for the sake of the article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, that's the article where we lay this out in most detail, that at least when they are recording non-miraculous events, the authors of the Gospels deserve as much credit as we would give to other authors who show as much familiarity with the setting of what they're talking about and are as close to that in time as they are. We don't say, and you have to do that with the miracle stories too. We actually bracket that question and we say, just grant us this with regard to the non-miraculous parts of the testimony, not to the claim and this miracle happened, but just to what they say they saw and what they say they heard. That's the kind of assumption that we make. We also make the assumption that some of these pieces of evidence are probabilistically independent. And we have a section where we discuss that. We actually have an argument that if independence fails, it probably fails in a direction that strengthens the argument rather than weakening the argument. But we could have a conversation about that. That's fine. So those are some assumptions that we make going in. I realize some of the skeptical people in your audience may be inclined to say, what craziness, you're saying that these authors are as trustworthy as somebody else would be if he were close up to the facts. That's nuts. These people are crazy. They're zealots. They just want to propagandize. But I think that the various lines of evidence that can be brought to bear, which we don't go into in great detail in that article, but like the undesigned coincidences, like the reconcilable variations, like the embarrassing details, like the unity of the portrayal of personalities across different authors, the unity of the character of Jesus across these different authors who are writing with some different purposes. Luke is clearly not writing for the kind of Jewish audience that Matthew is writing for, and yet the same guy comes out in all of them, the same Jesus with his reticence, his desire to get away from crowds, his manner of teaching, his use of object lessons and examples. It's not like Paul, it's not like Gamaliel, it's not like Hillel, it's not like anybody else that we have from the ancient world. He's really a unique character, and that comes across stereoscopically in all of the Gospels. When you look at all of that evidence put together, and you take due account of the kinds of charges that Bart Ehrman has made, and you go and you look into them, and I have a whole series of talks where I do nothing but look into these kinds of challenges. I got 4 hours worth of material just on that if you want to look it up on YouTube. I think the overall picture amply justifies taking these people as being at least as trustworthy as Tacitus or Josephus is when talking about things that lie within the experience of people that they're very close to in time and in circumstance. And so that seems to me to be a pretty minimal assumption. Notice I'm not saying you must agree that every word of this is inerrant and breathed of God. We can have a conversation about inspiration later. Right now, I'm just interested in basic historical reliability. Use the kinds of standards that we ought to use in all history. Let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, and as it goes to back that up, with the Gospels, you could also look in Acts and how Craig Keener, his books delve into Acts. Colin Hemer, Ben Witherington III. I'm sure you've written on Acts probably. There's so many authors that have written on Acts and that have shown that there are these historical markers of credibility. So I think it just raises the overall probability for that cumulative case.
Right. The book of Acts is a really good example because Acts takes place across a much wider geographical canvas than the Gospels do, right? You're up in Asia Minor and over in Macedonia and down the Peloponnese into the Greek Peninsula, and it's just full of notes of detail of place and circumstance. You've got local industries, local languages, geographic and political boundaries that changed in the middle of the first century. And so there's a lot of opportunity to get it wrong. You've got ports and landmarks around the Aegean Sea. You've got distances, you've got cities mentioned that are, as we now know from archaeology, a day's travel apart from one another. So people traveling by foot would be at one city one day, another city the next day. Just a wealth of information, very detailed information. And Acts, every sane scholar admits that Acts is written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. I'm going to call him Luke because I think he was Luke, the beloved physician. If Luke was this careful and got this much right in the book of Acts, this tells us something about his gospel. This tells us what kind of person wrote that gospel. This tells us what kind of handling of fact we can expect from him in the gospel. So I think a study of the historical reliability of Acts, and this is something I'll be talking about actually on an upcoming podcast with somebody else, so I'll give you guys that info when it's ready to go. This sheds light on the Gospels as well, and I think that it's a source of apologetic information we could certainly do more with. Colin Hemer lists over 100 points of contact with what we know from all manner of sources, and it's overwhelming, actually.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. I've also looked into, it's very possible that Paul references the Gospel of Luke a few times. So if that is so, that would be extraordinarily early dating.
Right. So there's one explicit statement, or he speaks of the brother whose fame in the gospel is known, widely known, and that may be actually a reference to the fact that Luke was at that time composing a gospel and reading bits to people at the various places where they stopped. It's not absolutely certain. I think it's a reasonable identification. I wouldn't put it at 100%, but that's life in history. And then there's also the fact that when Paul gives a description of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians, the language that he uses is very close, verbally very close to the language that we find in the Gospel of Luke. And since in the book of Acts, we have this interesting bit starting in Acts chapter 16, where the author's been talking about Paul's going somewhere. He went there, they went there. Suddenly it shifts over to the first person. We went there. And this we terminology then tracks throughout most of the remainder of the book. It really does look like Luke was a companion on that last set of journeys. In fact, There's an old book, because I'm a professor, can I tell you about old books? There's an old book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul by James Smith. Smith was a yachtsman who traveled to the Mediterranean, sailed over the entire course of Paul's journeys, and actually wintered at Malta to get a feel for what it would be like. And Smith has this meticulous discussion of every bit of that narrative in the last chapters of the shipwreck and the storm. And Smith just says, with lots and lots of evidence to back this up, that we can tell two things for sure about this narrative. The author was an eyewitness of the events that he records, and he was not a sailor, because there are some things that he records which are things sailors would have done, but only because it was an emergency, and he shows no awareness that it's a strange thing. For example, little flyover things. When they finally are getting close to the rocks and they're afraid of running aground and having the ship break up and dying there, they throw the anchor out the stern. We read that, we're like, yeah, okay, fine, they threw the anchor out the stern. That makes sense. Actually, that's not where the anchor would normally be thrown out. The anchor would normally be thrown off the bow of the ship. That's where it was. They had to carry this anchor back to the back of the ship. Why would they do that? Well, they're so close to the rocks, they're afraid if they anchor it at the bow of the ship, it'll pivot around the anchor, and then the stern of the ship will smash on the rocks. So they're anchoring it out the stern as an emergency move to keep it from getting any closer to the rocks forward of them. Little things like that Smith notes, and they're just detail upon detail upon detail. I can't recommend the book highly enough. So I'll give SJ a link that she can put in afterward, where you can get a free copy of Smith's book, because it's out of copyright, it's public domain, and still incredibly valuable today.
That's great. Thank you. Speak up a little bit more, because I think there's a little trouble in the audience hearing you.
Sorry, with me?
Oh no, with John.
Okay, Joseph. Okay.
All right. I wanted to say, with the reemergence of Christian philosophy in the last, 50 years, Christian apologetics, the well-known atheists like Anthony Flew coming to at least deism,
right,
and other well-known atheists and middle-level atheists, I guess. I think that there's no longer a justification for this David Hume type skepticism. Just as a joke, and in honor of one of my heroes, Thomas Reed, I think we should now call it hobby horse atheism.
Well, there are certainly plenty of people who have a sort of one song they like to sing, one theme they go on over and over, and often it is just, miracles do not happen. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean I didn't see my Uncle Joe raised from the dead? Agreed. The Christians have been shouting from the rooftops that the resurrection was a miracle. And it's not exactly going to be news to them if you say, excuse me, but there's something a little bit odd about it. Yeah, we know that already. Of course there is, right? It's a miracle. That's the point of it's being a miracle. It's not the kind of thing the universe does when left to itself. That's why we think the universe wasn't left to itself here, right? We get that it's not our normal experience. It's not my normal experience either. But if there's adequate evidence of it, then we have to take seriously the question, what does that mean? It has implications.
I want to go back on that, because there's a couple of people in the audience, like Slam RN, and I know you know her, Susan, and also Utopia Buster. And there's two questions that are coming up. And one is, what about the miracles today? And actually, Susan has had her own personal miracles. And then there's this Utopia Buster is asking you to define some of this evidence.
Okay, so let me take the question about contemporary miracles. So I don't get out much, apparently, because I haven't seen anything in my own circle of experience that I would myself call a miracle. However, my friend Craig Keener has, both in the experience of people he's very close to and documenting the experience of people not just far, far away, but in the United States recently with medical documentation, stuff that if it bears up under examination would absolutely be something we'd have to deal with as strong evidence of contemporary miracles. I haven't seen it myself. But when I read the stuff that Craig puts out there, and also the Canadian philosopher Robert Larmer has some examples of this, I say, well, maybe I need to get out more. So as far as that's concerned, I just have to look at that and say, well, wow, okay, that's something that bears looking into. So I'm a naturally very skeptical person, right? I'm not from the show me state, but sometimes I feel like I should be. I'm like, hold it. I'm going to need evidence for that. And so I don't want to speak outside the bounds of what I can say regarding my own experience, but it's not a matter to be settled a priori. One has to look into this and say, well, what are the actual facts of the matter? What do we actually know? What do we actually see? There are some criteria that we can use, I think, to come up with more and less promising candidates for miracle stories. And I think we should use such criteria, right? If the first reports are long after the event is supposed to have taken place, or if they're far away from the place it's supposed to have taken place, or if it's supposed to have taken place, but only in a context where the people who were there to see whether it happened or not had a vested interest in saying that it really was a miracle, and nobody with any kind of clout had any interest in debunking it. Those don't mean it didn't happen, but they're all reasons for some worry about it. And so I think we can very reasonably ask those kinds of questions. But I am persuaded that in the case of the central miracle claims that we find in the Gospels, of the resurrection being at the very heart of Christian faith, that's not the situation we're in. Actually, we're in a situation where people are proclaiming this at ground zero, where it's supposed to have happened, in the teeth of the opposition that just arranged for the crucifixion of Jesus, right? The Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities cooperated on this. And here they are on the day of Pentecost, out there saying, this Jesus whom you crucified, God has raised from the dead, of which we are witnesses. That is not something that they're saying happened long ago in a galaxy far away. So that immediacy of the testimony has to be taken into account. And when we're trying to evaluate these things, sure, we sift them. No, we don't just credulously say, I'll believe anything if it's in my holy book, right? Different people have different holy books. If you would just accept anybody's holy book, then why should we accept the Bible rather than the Quran, or rather than the Book of Mormon, or rather than the Bhagavad Gita? We need to sift these things. We need to have standards by which we sift these things. It's my contention that when you do it, and that's a process, it takes time, that you can't summarize this on the back of a napkin. But when you do it, if you do it right, you will come away saying, wow, this evidence is much better than I thought it was. Even Antony Flew, who did not, so far as I know, become a Christian at the end of his life, said the evidence for the resurrection is just not in the same league as the evidence for any other miracle claim ever. The evidence for the resurrection is in a class by itself, and it is just much more serious than anything else out there. It is, as far as that goes, it's Christianity or nothing, I think. And, obviously not everyone will agree. There are long conversations to be had there. But that's just, again, a taste of the direction that I would go in sifting the evidence. I want something that's early. I want something that is proximate, that is in the same location. But even the Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, says that this mischievous superstition, as he calls Christianity, so he's not a fan, right, broke out again after Jesus was killed, and spread from Jerusalem, so that's where it starts, all the way to Rome. So he tells us that, it broke out in Jerusalem. That's where it broke out. Wow, if you want to start a new religious cult, where do you want to do it? Tell you what, give you a one-way plane ticket if you want to start your own cult. And you can do it two places. You can try it in Milwaukee or in Mecca. Now, in Milwaukee, you might meet some atheists and some tough people, but maybe you would have some hope that some people would listen to you. In Mecca, you'll be dead before you hit baggage claim. Okay? You don't want to do this somewhere where people are intensely interested in persecuting you for putting forward the very idea of this. Well, that's what it was like in Jerusalem right there at the beginning. And you can see this in the person of Saul of Tarsus, who tells us that he was zealous and hauling people into jail and responsible for trying to get them killed. And he heads off to Damascus, breathing out threatenings and slaughterings. And then he gets knocked on his ass and does a 180 and becomes somebody who's no longer on the fast track to power in the Sanhedrin, but instead becomes the greatest missionary of the early church. Yeah, he hated the Christians, and he can't have been alone. He had letters from the Jewish authorities saying, yep, let him do this. So he was working with other people who were similarly zealous. He knew the arguments that had persuaded Caiaphas and Annas that Jesus was a deceiver of the people. And he was zealous to stop it. So it was not propitious for starting a new cult with a miracle claim. This isn't the place you want to do this. I have funny stories from history of people making other miracle claims and getting met with opposition. And but this is something that we would have expected anyway. And then we read the book of Acts, we find it is borne out. We read Paul's letters, it's borne out. Of course they faced opposition. Of course
it's a good way to get yourself killed also in that culture.
Yeah, what a clever way to make sure that you pass your life in labors and dangers and sufferings at the least, right? Let's stick a finger in the eye of Judaism, which is the religion of almost all of the people around us right here, right now. Let's tell them that your national aspirations are now going to be set aside. The franchise has been open to Gentiles. Let's tell them that the entire elaborate system of sacrifice is no longer obligatory, that people don't have to undergo the Jewish ceremonies and become Jewish proselytes, that they don't have to keep the laws that were given ceremonially to the Jews to keep them separate from others. This is not a message designed to ingratiate you with a Jewish audience, but it is the message that uniformly gets preached in the New Testament, and we see the outworking of that in the development of the early church. So, yeah, not a religion designed to make converts. You know, Muhammad, when he set out to promote Islam, first took the very ironic approach, oh, we are all people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. And, you know, he sort of preached a can't we all get along religion. For 10 years, he made about one convert a month. Most of them were members of his extended family. Then he decided to go military. So you take a double dose of testosterone, shake hard. It worked like a charm. It's the same recipe that Joseph Smith tried later with Mormonism. And wow, now that's a way to start a religion. Christianity didn't start that way at all.
I often hear about skeptics say, well, we have science today. They didn't have science back then. And then I'm reminded of, I believe it's either Richard Whatley or William Paley, who said that the Jews, the people in that context, knew when a person was dead. The fact that they reported someone dead, then alive again, alive and then dead and then alive again, that can be established by historical credible witnesses.
Right. I think one of the first people to say that, who at least in a sort of popular way, was Thomas Sherlock in his Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, which was written when Hume was a teenager. Sherlock says, look, you know, a man living and a man dead are both objects of sense. It's not like we're talking about abstract metaphysical principles here. Just how ignorant was a first century Jew? Didn't know where babies come from, didn't know the difference between a living man and a dead man. Come on, these are people who live much closer to death and birth than most of us. Most of us hear about it, we see the pics on Facebook, but we're not there, you know, with blood on our hands and wrists as we've been assisting in a live birth. We're not there closing the eyes, physically touching them and closing the eyes of somebody who's dying. We don't see this as up close as they did. They were at least as good as we were at determining these things. And frankly, Roman soldiers were professional killers. They knew how to kill a man. This is not rocket science. So you don't have to have an advanced degree in microbiology in order to understand the difference between a living person and a dead person. They had that down pretty well.
You've made some really, really great points. I just wanted to point out something from the audience before this gets past us, but Slam RN, who's also Susan, she apparently had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she was on her deathbed, she said, and then she heard God basically tell her that he was going to cure her, and then she was cured, and she said that Craig Keener is investigating her story now.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. He's exactly the guy that you want to be investigating it. So that's fantastic. And also, that's a wonderful story. So I didn't know this about Susan, although we are in contact in other ways. So that's fantastic to know.
Yeah, and so I wanted to also say, I know we're coming up on 4:30 my time. I think, but anyway, so I wanted to see if maybe we should try to go to the audience and see if anyone has any final questions, and we can kind of get towards wrapping things up.
I had two things to say. First of all, before we do that, I was in a 1-month-long coma and given no hope of survival past the first night. And they wanted to donate my organs and everything. 2 weeks before that happened, my brother, a baseball player in high school, senior year, he has a dream of Jesus. And Jesus tells him, have faith, but everything's going to be okay. They're going to be in a car accident. He tells his coach, and this is documented. I've asked my brother, the coach, my mother, everything. I think Craig Keener's work that shows miracles do happen today is it's bringing to light and unwrapping all this unwarranted David Hume skepticism all over again.
Well, you should definitely be in touch with Craig in that case and let him know that you have documented evidence like this, because that's exactly the sort of thing he likes to collect. So yeah. Absolutely.
I have the witnesses. I know them. I've talked to them many times.
Okay.
And the last thing I wanted to tell you, the centrality of the message of Jesus. Do you have any encouraging words that you can tell to other Christians, other people that have maybe been harassed or go through difficult times? The Christian life is not meant to be easy, right? You're meant to go through persecution. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah. So some of you will know what I'm referring to when I mentioned that there's a book out there, a very popular book. I think it was a New York Times bestseller, called Your Best Life Now. I keep threatening to some of my friends that one day I'm just going to break down and write a book called Your Worst Life Now. And it's going to start with some commentary on the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, because Jesus says some pretty harsh things there. I remember when my oldest daughter was in her, I think, early teens, she was sitting reading Matthew 5. It got to the bit, blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice, be glad. This is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And she put the book down and she said, that's not very comforting. And in one sense, it isn't very comforting, right? And in one sense, you look at that and you say, whoa, I wanted a God who was going to give me the nice stuff if I donated enough to my church and prayed enough times a day. How come he's saying life's going to be terrible? But again, be of good cheer, he says in the Gospel of John. I have overcome the world, right? Yeah, you're going to have trial and tribulation. So I would say what Christianity does is not to provide us with any kind of shield or guarantee against human sorrow, human tragedy of the kind that befalls many of us from time to time. But instead it says, this isn't the end. This isn't ultimately what matters most. There is something that matters more than that. And I am with you always. And that is where our hope is. Our hope is not that if we're just good enough, devout enough, our children won't die of bone cancer. That's not the promise. It's not that if we try hard enough to be nice, we will get nice cars and our house will never burn down and everything will go the way we like. That's not the promise. The promise is that things can get really bad, but that's okay. And so we shouldn't be surprised when these things happen. And we certainly should not tell anyone else, oh, it's okay, bad stuff won't happen to you because you're a Christian, it's all good. That's a lie. That's a terrible lie. And if we can get away from that, then we can begin to have a conversation about what's really happening, what's real, and the kind of suffering that we can expect to go through. And then we can bear one another's burdens. We can rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. So if there were just one thing I could say to people who maybe are suffering, who are going through some hard times, it is, this is what was promised, this is what was expected, but it's not the end of the story. And it doesn't have to overwhelm you, even though it feels overwhelming as you're going through it. And then those of us who are Christians and who know people who are going through that need to step up and be the kinds of friends that we should be while they're going through that. And that's on us, right? God lets us be his hands and his feet. And it's no good if we just say, be warmed, be filled, it's all good, and then we turn them away. That doesn't work.
I think, and I'll just end with this, and I'll let you go to the questions, SJ. Mm-hmm. But I think it's so pleasing, it's so satisfying to know that Christianity just isn't simply an academic affair, but it touches the heart, and there's a way to be better than we ourselves can. There's a way to treat people. You treat people the way you yourself would like to be treated, not to harass, not to harm, not to cause conflict, but because we are our brother's keeper, and we can be, helped. And I think we should all, learn to live that way. I was at church just last Sunday, the centrality of Christ. If this really happened, if I really believe it, the resurrection, then I have nothing to fear.
Yeah. There's a Wall Street investment banker who left his job and went on the road to find out what's going on in sort of down and out America. He wrote a book called Dignity. And he talks about drug pushers and people who have no education, just people that are really, truly down and out. And it's funny, he's being interviewed about it. And one of the things that the interviewer says is, you also visited many churches. As an atheist, what was that like? And it's fascinating the way he responds. He says, I was certainly an atheist when I began. It's more complicated now. And what he says is, the churches worked. They were often the only institutions that were lit up and functional. You could go down a street that was boarded up, derelict buildings, and then there was a church. Its doors weren't closed. There aren't many success stories in my book. There's almost nobody who got out of a negative lifestyle. The only people who succeeded did it through faith, through the church. And so I had at first a grudging respect and then a full-blown respect for what churches are doing. That's the testimony of a guy who entered into this as an atheist, and he's, dare I say it, I think he's worried now that maybe atheism isn't true, because this was the only place where this was actually happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to go back to what you said, even on the religion of comfort. There's a couple things you said I just want to build on. I like what C.S. Lewis said about that too. So C.S. Lewis said, if I were looking for a religion of comfort, it certainly wouldn't be Christianity. He said, I could go for a bottle of port. That would satisfy me. And
right there. Absolutely.
He said, but it's other things. But another thing that you said that I want to also mention is, what you're distinguishing here is the difference between what they call intrinsic religiosity versus extrinsic. And it seems to me that you're very much an intrinsic religiosity. You're high probably on that scale. And that basically just says you have a very deep understanding of the religion instead of that surface level, I'm going to try to get what I can out of it sort of thing.
Yeah, that we are nowhere given any encouragement to think that if we approach this for what we can get out of it, then we're safe. That's just not the message of the New Testament anywhere at all.
And so that brings up another question. There's a couple questions that I left outstanding. One of them is utopia. And she said, or he or she, I'm actually not sure if utopia is a male or female, but was wondering if you could define the term evidence.
Sure. The way that I'm using it, something counts as evidence for a hypothesis, just in case, on the assumption that the hypothesis were true, you would expect this thing more strongly than you would if it were false. So it's something that, if you adopt mentally the standpoint, well, suppose it were true, would I expect this thing, this fact, this observation more strongly than I would expect it if the hypothesis were false? And we do this in science constantly, right? Why did the New York Times pull out its really big letters when the results of the solar eclipse came back in 1919? Why did they say Einstein was right? Because Einstein's theory predicted a certain kind of shift in the visible position of stars around the blocked out solar disk during that eclipse. And we could do photographic plates, so there was no subjectivity involved in measuring those distances. And the Newtonian theory of light did not predict that shift. Even on a ballistic theory, it didn't predict a shift of that magnitude. So comes the test. Einstein leads you to expect it. Newton does not. Einstein was right. We use this in science. We use this in detection. We use this in auto mechanics. We use this in medicine. It's a kind of inference that we use everywhere. And so this is the definition of evidence that I'm using, and it's got a lovely mathematical formulation, which I won't give you right now because that would drive everybody away, but it's that's the sense in which I'm using the word evidence.
Okay. And I have
studied
another.
this, and it would drive me away too. So thank you very much.
No, that's good. I have another question. I wanted to, and that makes a lot of sense, and it's a great example with Einstein. I also wanted to ask, another person had asked about, what about, and I don't know how much you've studied, and I haven't read Craig Keener's book yet on miracles, but have you found cases where people in other countries worshiping other gods have miracles that they attribute to these other gods?
Again, I haven't read through Keener's entire book. I have dipped into it. I've looked at parts of it. Parts of it are an analysis of Hume's argument. Parts of it are case studies. And I have not checked to see all that he has collected. He himself says right up front, this is not, sort of a random collection of these things. We're relying on people who report them. The people who report these things to us will no doubt report them in the circumstances, in the circles in which we move at a higher rate than from others. Would it shock me if there were instances where there are sort of healings that have no plausible natural explanation that come up in Hinduism, Buddhism? No, it wouldn't shock me. All of the examples have to be sifted. That's all that I say. Again, that even when we're talking about evidence that's putatively evidence for a position I endorse, no double standards. Look at all of this on the same plane. So I don't think that Keener would say that he has equal access to sources that are as likely to give those kinds of things. But I do know that he's not looking to ignore or hide any kind of things like that. So if he has such examples, they would be worth looking into. If he doesn't, he would probably tell you that's because those people probably aren't talking to me. But he's certainly looking.
Good. And Samuel Park is asking a couple of questions that are very relevant to you. Actually, someone wasn't thinking her first question was relevant, or his first question, but I see the second one corresponds to what you do. Samuel's asking, he says, what about in churches? Do we feel the current model is a good model where people go to service maybe for an hour on Sunday morning, then maybe they'll catch a Bible study and maybe one more activity in the week, and then that's pretty much it? Or should you think that churches should start teaching philosophy and apologetics? And that sounds like it's the part that's really close to you.
I guess what I would say is there's not a one size fits all answer here. Some people honestly would fall asleep even faster if they were given philosophy and apologetics than they do in the service that they actually attend. And some people would love it. And I think what we need to do is to make available to people more than we currently make available to them. True confession, I dropped out of my high school church youth group. Just nothing there of interest. You can only do so many pizza parties and roller skating socials before you say, where is this all going? If you had told me, hey, we're going to have some folding chairs in the back room and somebody's going to sit there and talk about how there could be so much suffering if God is good and is really omniscient and omnipotent, I'd have been there like a shot. And my guess is, so would some of the other kids in my age group. but we get scared. And one of the saddest things that I hear pastors and youth leaders saying is, oh, the kids couldn't handle that. They couldn't understand that. Really? Have you talked to them about this lately? Have you given them a list of tough questions and said, have you heard any of these questions, kids? Try that. Make a list of the dangerous questions that you pray people won't ask in church, and ask your students, do you have these questions? More or less all of them have heard them. Some of them stay up late at night worrying about them, and we are just sticking our heads in the sand if we don't think they have serious questions and want serious answers. So not everybody wants that, but a lot more people want it than you would think. And so we need to get out and make that available. It may not be the theme of all of our preaching every Sunday, although, once in a while, working in an undesigned coincidence into your sermons, probably not a bad idea.
I agree. Oh, sorry.
Rodney Stark talks about in some of his books, including The Triumph of Christianity, and in his other books, that if you don't artificially, cut down the supply of religion, that is, let churches come, be built, different people will go to different sized churches. There's a niche for every type of church, every type of emphasis. So when you have a free market of Christianity, of capitalism, you have the most sophisticated understanding of God generally, not all the time, but generally arise. And that's one reason why Christianity is
I understand what you're saying, but I do worry, there's a downside to that too, that you get prosperity gospel preachers and they're very, very popular. So I agree. If we try to impose uniformity, we end up looking like Russia, right? Where the Russian Orthodox Church has this complete lock on what goes on there, and other people have to meet in the woods, or get heavily regulated. We get what we have in China, where there's an approved church, but if you're not a member of that and you're in the underground church, then you're out of luck. It's a really rough kind of place to be. So there, letting 1,000 flowers bloom is probably our best hope. But as we do that, the weeds are going to grow up sometimes, and we have to be aware of that as well.
Well, that's why we have apologists like you to cut those weeds down.
Well, thank you. I will go home and think of myself as a weed cutter now.
I want to say, I think we should probably conclude, because we've gone a bit over our time, and so I wanted to say thank you to both of you for coming on. It's been wonderful having you. I love listening to just knowledge being shared in this way, and I think it's been very positive for the audience. And I also agree with many of your points, and I feel like I learned something new today, and just the way that you phrase things going on in the Roman Empire. I'm really going to think about that, because some of the things that you said I really hadn't given as much thought, and I really like the idea with Mecca, because I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that's so true.
Yeah. Right. Where'd you go to start a new religion? Place where they're killing people who try to start new religions? Probably not a winning strategy.
Yeah. Start a Southern Baptist church in Mecca. See what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's true. So where can people find you? Both of you. We'll start with Tim.
Yeah. So I am available online. You can find my videos on YouTube. I curate a website called historicalapologetics.org, where you can download free books. I have nothing to sell you. It's just free stuff. And I try to keep some of the best stuff available there. There are brief biographies, brief summaries of this material. If you also go to specialdivineaction.org, there's a research part of that website. Great website. Lots of good stuff to kick around, but there's a research section of that where I have 2 entire college courses that I've taught on some of this material, on the deist controversy and the great debate of the 19th century on miracles. And it's really some fascinating material. We read people on the pro and on the con side there. And so if you want to just get all those lectures, they're all available for free at specialdivineaction.org. I also hang out on Facebook. I'm a member of the Christian Apologetics Alliance. So if you have questions there, that's a great group of thousands of Christians worldwide who help to answer questions like that. So yeah, you can find me in a lot of those places. You can look me up online, send me an email note. I do get overwhelmed with emails sometimes, but I try to respond to as much of it as I can. And so if you have a serious question and you write me politely and not just to tell me what an idiot I am, then I will probably try to write back.
Oh, you get those emails too.
Don't we all? I mean, I'm sorry. The hyenas out there are really active, especially at night, I think.
Yeah, that's portended.
The hobby horse atheists haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah, and they won't, and that's all right.
So where can we find you?
By the way, we want to say we respect everybody, including those we disagree with. I'm just studying. I pretty much stick to myself nowadays. I study a lot. I study people like Tim McGrew, the scholar we have here, a scholar and friend. And I have certainly listened to some of those courses that you have online. Encourage others to do the same. I'm preparing to be involved in some big debates with top atheists, and that's what I do.
All right.
Wonderful.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. I also wanted to say I'm going to put links to some of the things that you like these specialdefinedaction.org. I'm going to put the links into the description here so that people can find you in the future. And I really appreciate you coming on. Please say hi to your wife, Lydia.
I will do
had
it.
her on a couple times and she was a pleasure to be with. And so thank you so much. Specialdefinedaction.org. Perfect.
I'm just putting a couple of URLs here. Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on, and I hope that your listeners have found something of value in it.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.